Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on ISO 14001.2015.
ISO 14001.
It's like the framework for any organization that wants to seriously think about managing and minimizing their environmental impact. So we're talking about an environmental management system or an EMS and how it can drive some serious change.
Yeah, exactly. And listeners might be familiar with ISO 9000, which is the standard for quality. Well, ISO 14001 is kind of the environmental counterpart to that, and really helps organizations, not just reduce their negative impacts on the environment, but continually improve their environmental performance. So that's what this deep dive is really going to unpack. What this standard entails and why it matters and might be relevant to our listeners, who are interested in gaining some knowledge about effective management practices.
We've got a really comprehensive set of materials here today, and they give us this complete picture of ISO 14001.2015, covering everything from why it exists to the nuts and bolts of how it works and the kind of benefits it can deliver. And our mission today is pretty straightforward. It's to give you, the listener, a solid understanding of what this standard is all about and why it's important.
Right.
So let's just jump right in. What is ISO 14001.2045?
Well, at its core, ISO 14001.2015 is part of a family of international standards, and they all relate to environmental management. And there are three main aims, and those are first, to minimize any negative environmental impacts that are caused by an organization's activities, products, services. Think pollution of air and water, reducing waste, preventing land damage. The second is to make sure that they're complying with any relevant environmental laws and regulations. And then the third one is to continually improve their environmental performance.
So it doesn't actually dictate specific levels of environmental performance that a company has to meet. It's more about giving them a system for how to manage those responsibilities.
Precisely. It's similar to ISO 9000 in that it focuses on the process of how a product or service is produced rather than the product itself. So ISO 14001.2015 specifically outlines the criteria for an effective EMS, but it doesn't actually set environmental targets. Instead, it provides a framework for organizations to develop their own targets and achieve them.
And it's voluntary, right? It's not like a law or regulation in most cases.
That's right. It's voluntary.
Yeah.
But by implementing it, it provides assurance to the organization itself, its stakeholders, that it's taking its environmental responsibilities seriously and is committed to measuring and improving its impact. And what's really interesting is it can be integrated with other management functions. So you can meet both environmental and economic goals using this standard. And as I said, it can be applied to a whole range of organizations. Each organization sets its own performance targets, and the standard provides the framework for achieving them.
So it can be used by, whether you're a small shop on a street corner or a huge multinational corporation.
Absolutely.
This framework can apply to all sorts of different things.
Yeah, and it's called a generic management system standard, which means its principles can be applied regardless of the size, location, or sector of the organization. So it can be used by small, single-site operations or large multinational corporations. It applies to high-risk industries like manufacturing and lower-risk service providers. It can be used in the public sector as well as the private sector, so it really does span a whole spectrum of different organizational types.
Okay, so we're starting to get a picture of what it is. Now, one thing I kept seeing pop up in our research was this term Plan Do Check Act. Why is that important?
Well, this is the methodology that underpins ISO 10001.2015. So it's a dynamic four-stage cycle that provides a structured way for an organization to establish, implement, maintain, and most importantly, continually improve its EMS. And it starts with plan. And that involves defining your environmental objectives and figuring out the process you need to achieve them.
So what does that actually look like, that plan phase?
Right. Well, it usually starts with an initial environmental review or gap analysis. And this is to identify all the ways in which the organization interacts with the environment. These are called environmental aspects. So they can be direct, such as emissions from its facilities, or indirect, like the environmental impact of the materials it purchases. And based on this understanding, you establish what are called measurable environmental objectives, goals, and targets. You also develop the procedures that you need to control and manage these aspects. And crucially, you identify all the relevant legal requirements that apply to your operations.
So it's like kind of taking stock of where you are.
Yeah.
Defining where you want to be environmentally. And then mapping out how to get there on paper.
Exactly. It's setting the framework.
Okay. So then what's do?
Do is the next stage.
Yeah.
And this is where you put those plans into action. So you need to identify and allocate any resources that you might need. This could be personnel, equipment, financial resources, technology, and you assign clear responsibility for implementing and controlling the various elements of the EMS.
Yeah.
You establish operational procedures, and in fact, the standard specifically requires that you have a documented procedure for operational control.
Just one documented procedure.
Yeah, this relates to the significant environmental aspects.
Okay.
And it's interesting because that's the only procedure that is actually required to be documented.
Oh, that seems pretty minimal.
Yeah, it does seem minimal, but in practice, most organizations would need quite a few more procedures than that to effectively manage their aspects and ensure that everything runs consistently. And so DO also encompasses things like managing your documentation, preparing for any environmental emergencies, and ensuring that all your employees have the necessary education and training to fulfill their environmental responsibilities.
Yeah.
And a key element of DO is ensuring communication and participation at all levels of the organization. And the standard emphasizes the leadership from top management in this area.
So everybody needs to be on board
Exactly.
and have the knowledge to do their part. So that's do. So then we're on to check.
Yes, check. And check is all about measuring and monitoring your environmental performance.
Okay.
So you're tracking progress against the targets that you set in the plan stage. And also, you conduct internal audits to verify that your EMS is meeting requirements and that it's being implemented and maintained properly.
Okay. So it's like a health check for your EMS.
Exactly.
Making sure it's actually doing what it should be doing.
Exactly.
Okay. So then what's ACT? That's the last piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. So ACT is where you take action based on the findings from the check stage. So this usually involves a management review. And top management looks at whether environmental objectives are being met, how effective communication has been, and if there have been any changes in the context, like new legal requirements. And based on this review, recommendations for improvement are made and they're implemented.
So it feeds back into the plan stage. It's like a circle.
Precisely. Yeah, it's a continual loop of improvement.
So it's never done. It's always you're always working on it.
Yeah, the whole cycle's designed to drive continual improvement. And what's interesting is it can operate at different levels, from the strategic direction of the whole organization right down to the day-to-day operational control of particular aspects. So it's quite a versatile tool in that respect.
Okay. So this continual improvement process, the CIP, is really at the heart of the standard.
Yes.
It's not just about making one or two changes and calling it a day.
No, exactly. And this CIP has 3 dimensions. So the first is expansion. And that means gradually expanding your EMS to cover more and more of the organization's activities.
So, for example, a company might start by implementing the EMS in, say, one production facility, and then gradually roll it out to other departments, other sites, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. That would be a good example of expansion. And then the second dimension is enrichment.
Okay.
And this means managing a wider array of environmental aspects. So this might mean looking at more types of emissions, managing more resources, thinking about the impact of different products. It's about being more thorough and more far-reaching.
Okay, so instead of just looking at, say, factory emissions, they might start to think about, the environmental impacts of their supply chain or the waste that's generated in their offices.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And then the third dimension is upgrading. And that's about improving the EMS itself. So this might involve improving the procedures, strengthening the organizational roles and responsibilities, and building greater environmental know-how throughout the organization. And the overall goal of this continual improvement process is to shift from simply reacting to issues at an operational level to a more strategic approach to environmental challenges.
Okay. Sounds like quite a transformation for a company that really embraces it. Okay, so let's talk about this concept of environmental control.
Yeah.
It seems like the standard really pushes organizations to think hard about what they're trying to manage.
Yeah, absolutely. The fundamental aim of any EMS, including ISO 14001, is to minimize environmental impacts through controlling its activities, products, and services. But, and this is an important point, just implementing environmental controls in an unstructured way can be ineffective. In fact, it can be really misleading, because you might end up focusing on issues that are relatively minor and overlooking those that have a truly significant impact.
Yeah, and we saw that example, that striking example in the research of that mining company that was making a big deal about their, recycling light bulbs in their office.
Yeah.
While, the environmental damage from the actual mining was kind of just ignored.
Exactly. Exactly. That's exactly the kind of what they call gut feel approach, focusing on something that's easy to tackle and looks good, but doesn't actually make a big difference. And a structured system, like the one that ISO 14001 requires, involves a few key steps. So first, you have to identify all the environmental aspects associated with your activities, both direct and indirect. Then you have to use a logical methodology to rank these aspects by their significance, the magnitude, and likelihood of their impact. And then thirdly, you focus the management system on minimizing the significant impacts.
So it's about being strategic and using data
Yes.
rather than just doing what's easy or what looks good on a press release.
Precisely. Yeah. It's about directing your environmental management efforts where they will have the greatest positive impact.
Okay, so if a company invests the time and resources to actually implement ISO 14001 properly, what kind of benefits can they expect to see? Like, why would an organization go to all this trouble?
Well, the benefits are really substantial.
Okay.
And they go beyond just environmental performance. They can affect the bottom line as well. So first and foremost, you have a framework for better management control, which translates into reduced environmental impacts. But then there are economic benefits as well. So, for example, there is evidence that organizations implementing ISO 14001 have seen savings of 10 to 15% in waste disposal costs and 5 to 10% in energy consumption through efficiency improvements.
Wow, those are real tangible saving.
Yeah.
What else? What other kinds of economic benefits are there?
Well, you've got higher levels of compliance with environmental regulations, which can help minimize the risk of fines and penalties.
Sure.
And you've got improved operational efficiency, leading to reduced waste, lower resource consumption, and lower operating costs. ISO 14001 is internationally recognized, so it can really simplify operations for organizations that have multiple locations in different countries.
Oh, that makes sense.
Instead of having to navigate a complex web of different local environmental certifications, they could just have one ISO 14001 certification.
Makes it much easier.
Yeah. And that could be a big plus for multinational companies.
Yeah.
And then, of course, consumers and stakeholders are increasingly environmentally conscious. So having an ISO 14001 certification can give you a competitive advantage. It can enhance your brand reputation, and it can potentially increase your asset value.
Yeah, it shows you're taking it seriously.
Exactly. Yeah. It improves public perception, strengthens your position in international markets, and it can also be good for attracting new business and talent.
So it's not just about doing the right thing for the environment.
Yeah,
It can actually have a really positive impact on your bottom line.
absolutely.
Okay, so an organization decides, okay, we want to show our stakeholders that we are in line with ISO 14001.
Yeah.
What are the different ways they can do that?
Right. Well, our resources talked about conformity assessment.
Yeah.
And there are 4 options that are generally recognized. The first is self-determination and self-declaration. So that's where an organization assesses itself against the standard and then publicly declares that it meets the requirements.
So they're essentially saying, we're compliant, trust us.
Yeah, in a nutshell.
Okay.
And the second option is to seek confirmation from interested parties, like customers or partners.
Okay.
And this often takes the form of a second-party environmental audit.
So, for example, a big client might audit their supplier's environmental practices.
Precisely, yeah. And the third option is to get confirmation of their self-declaration by an external party.
Yeah.
So an independent body comes in and checks that their self-assessment is accurate. And then the fourth option, and probably the most well-known, is to actually get certified by an external certification body. And this involves a third-party audit by an organization that's accredited by a national accreditation body, like, for example, UK's in the UK.
So that's the official, we have the stamp of approval.
Exactly.
Yeah, we're ISO 14001 certified kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
And it's worth noting that ISO itself doesn't actually control this process. So they have a neutral policy on which option organizations choose. And the best approach really depends on the specific needs of the organization and what their market expects.
Yeah.
And one final point on this, the resources emphasized that the term self-certify, it's not an acceptable term in the ISO world.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it can be misleading about the level of independent verification.
Wow, it.
So it's best to avoid that term.
Okay. So let's talk about the 2015 revision.
Yeah.
What were some of the main changes that happened in the structure of the standard? I remember seeing something about Annex SL.
Yeah, NXSL, that was a big one. And That's now called the high-level structure, or the HLS.
Okay.
And this provides a standardized framework for all ISO management systems.
Okay.
And the aim here is to create consistency across different standards.
Right.
So if you've got ISO 19001 for quality, ISO 14001 for environment,
Right.
they should all have the same basic structure. And that's the idea behind Annex SL.
So it makes it easier for an organization, for example, that already has ISO 9001.
Yes.
It should make it much easier for them to implement 14001 because it's,
Like that.
there's a familiarity there.
Yeah. And it also makes it easier to integrate different management systems together and to get senior management buy-in across the board. So those are some of the advantages. And in fact, the biggest change in the 2015 version of ISO 14001 was really just aligning it with this new HLS. So the clause numbers changed.
Okay.
Some of the terminology was tweaked,
Okay.
but the underlying principles remained largely the same.
So it's really just a matter of, if they're using different terminology, they don't have to suddenly change all their internal documents to match the new standard.
Exactly. Yeah, as long as the underlying requirements are being met, it's generally fine.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, and you mentioned documented information before.
Yes.
What does that actually cover?
Well, ISO 14001.2015 uses this term documented information to replace the old categories of documents and records. And it basically just means any information that needs to be controlled and maintained.
Okay.
So that could be environmental policies, procedures, work instructions, data,
Right.
anything that's needed to make the EMS work properly.
Okay, so it's all under this umbrella now.
Yeah. And it's just a change in terminology.
Okay.
The underlying principle is still the same.
Okay.
So when it says maintain documented information, it's talking about what used to be called documents.
Right.
And when it says retain documented information as evidence of, it's talking about what used to be called records.
Yeah.
So what kind of information does this standard actually require an organization to maintain?
Well, there are a few things. So, for example, they have to maintain their scope,
Okay.
their environmental policy,
Right.
the risks and opportunities that they've identified,
Okay.
the criteria they use to evaluate their aspects,
Sure.
the aspects themselves,
Right.
their significant aspects,
Got it.
their objectives and plans,
Like
their operational controls,
Okay.
and their emergency preparedness procedure.
Got it. Okay. So it's really about formalizing, like writing things down and making sure that there's a record of it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Because this provides a basis for ensuring that the EMS is well-defined, consistently implemented, and communicated.
Sure.
And in addition to all of that, there are also records that need to be kept. So things like compliance obligations,
Right.
training records,
Right.
communication records, monitoring results,
Yeah.
audit results,
But
management review results.
nonconformities and corrective actions.
So evidence that things have actually been done.
Exactly.
Are there other documents other than the required ones that companies might, typically develop and maintain?
Yes, definitely. Although the standard allows flexibility, there are certain documents that are considered best practice. So, for example, you might have procedures for determining the context of the organization,
Okay.
procedures for identifying aspects, procedures for managing competence,
Okay.
communication, document control, internal audit, management review, nonconformity, and corrective action.
Right.
So all these kinds of things can be helpful in making sure that the EMS is implemented effectively.
So even if they're not specifically required,
Yeah.
it's a good idea to have them in place.
Yeah, because it brings consistency and effectiveness.
Okay. So looking back at this whole evolution of the standard, what would you say are the most significant changes in emphasis from the previous versions to this 2015 revision?
Right. Well, there are a few key shifts, I think, that are worth highlighting.
Okay.
As we mentioned already, there's a much stronger emphasis on leadership and the integration of environmental management into the core business processes.
Right.
So it's not just a separate add-on anymore.
Right.
And there's a much more proactive consideration of risks and opportunities.
Okay.
There's a greater focus on compliance obligations,
Right.
not just legal requirements.
Okay.
And then, of course, the life cycle perspective, which is a big change.
Sure.
And the standard also moves away from this focus on prevention of pollution to a more holistic approach to protection of the environment, which includes things like climate change and biodiversity.
Okay.
And the terminology has changed as well.
Mm.
So environmental targets are now part of environmental objectives.
Right.
And the requirement for a management representative has been removed.
Okay.
And those responsibilities are now distributed. And finally, there's more emphasis on managing change.
Got it.
So yeah, it's quite a significant evolution.
Yeah, sounds like it. Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive into ISO 14000 1.201.5. As we're starting to wind down here, what are the most important takeaways that you would want our listeners to remember?
Well, I think that the key points are that ISO 14001 1.201 FEE provides this really valuable framework for organizations that want to improve their environmental performance. It's based on this Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, which drives continual improvement. And it's really important to understand your organization's context and the needs of your stakeholders.
Okay.
Implementing ISO 14001 can bring a lot of benefits, both environmental and economic.
Right.
And the 2015 revision introduced some important updates like the high-level structure, the life cycle perspective, and the focus on documented information. So really, it's a tool that can help organizations minimize their environmental impact, meet their obligations, and achieve their goals in a structured and sustainable way.
So listeners, if you've been, thinking about how you can better manage your environmental responsibilities in your organization or in your life even, ISO 14001.2015, it's definitely a framework that's worth checking out.
Absolutely.
And just a final thought.
Yes.
Given this interconnectedness that the life cycle perspective really highlights, how might a deeper understanding of environmental management systems like ISO 14001 not only affect the way organizations work, but also the way individuals make choices
Right.
and ultimately contribute to broader sustainability efforts in society as a whole?
Yeah, that's a really important point, and it's something that we should all be thinking about. How can we as individuals contribute to a more sustainable future?
That's a great question to leave our listeners with.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, happy exploring.